Every once in a while, we take on a subject that just seems like a huge undertaking. Like we're going to scratch the surface, but we're never going to hit on all of this. This is one of those. Hey gang, Jason Emmett here, and we're doing things a bit different today on Rewind Toys. Now, mostly we talk about things like action figures, but occasionally we do dabble in something, toy adjacent. And today is another one of those. Pop quiz. If I were to ask, what was the first home video gaming console, would you know? I think there are quite a few who would want to say Atari, and that's fair, as it was one of the first to really leave its stamp on the home consoles, but there were a few prior to that. The first was the Magnavox Odyssey, which actually landed in 1973. Now, we're not going in depth with the Odyssey today, but another company did have some involvement with that system, and it's that company and their breakout home system that we're going to be discussing. So sit back and together we'll take a trip to 1985 and look at the Nintendo Entertainment Center. All right, first from here on out, we're probably just going to call it NES or NES because it's easier. Now, I think all of us have a favorite home system. For me, it's the Super Nintendo, but no matter what yours might be, we should all agree that it was the NES that really set home gaming industry into motion. Now listen, there's just a ton of technical jargon and stuff and corporate mumbo jumbo locked up in the story of the rise of the NES, and I'm going to do my best to kind of streamline that and make it simple, but just bear with me. Late 70s and early 80s, video games were booming. Arcades ruled the scene, and the youth of America, they were all in. Of course, companies were trying to break into the home market, and systems like the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, they'd been fairly successful, but nothing managed to capture that arcade feel. Believe it or not, Nintendo started out making playing cards and a few other toys before making the move to electronics and video games in the 70s. In 1981, they released an arcade game that, hit the industry like a hammer. Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong would become one of the highest grossing games in 1981 and also in 1982, and it would also introduce us to Mario, at the time known as Jumpman. It would also introduce us to DK, Donkey Kong, and Pauline. It also put Nintendo on the board in the United States, which was a really big deal. The Donkey Kong success was great, but Nintendo wanted to find a way to convert that game to home audiences and still have it feel and look like the arcade, unlike some other home games. I'm looking at you, Pac-Man. In 1982, a team headed by Masayuki Yumura set out to create an affordable system able to crush the competition with smoother gameplay and better graphics. I don't want to get all technical and sciencey, but essentially, the company figured out how to use the Donkey Kong's chip, the D-pad from the Game & Watch handheld system, an 8-bit processing chip, and a 15-pin expansion port connection to create the family computer that you probably know better as the Famicom. Now, Famicom hit Japan's market in 1983 and it retailed for about $150. That's just under $500 in 2025 money. It also hit with launch titles such as Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. There were a few, we'll call them hiccups, with the first release, but by 1984, nearly 3 million units had been sold, and Famicom was smashing the competition. Now, Nintendo wants to move into the United States market, so they reach out to Atari and they try to cut a deal, which they do, initially. But before the papers could even be signed, Atari, they back out of the deal. Then came the video game crash of 1983. Now, I hear a lot about this video game crash. Now, as a kid in the 80s, I don't recall any real period of my life when games weren't present, but it did happen. Arcades started to lose, they started to lose customers. The fame, it was sort of, the popularity was kind of going down. Arcades and lackluster home systems, they took a massive dive. Nintendo needed to pivot if they wanted to survive, and so, they did. They released the Nintendo Versus system into U.S. arcades in 1984. Now, this was an arcade cabinet based around the same hardware as the home console that allowed several games to be played. It was sort of their way of testing the waters and promoting their system, and it turned out to be a smart move. By 1985, it was the highest grossing arcade cabinet in the US. So that was their cue to move forward with the home system, but this time, they wanted to do it on their own. Would American buyers go for it? Well, Gail Tilden, the marketing manager for Nintendo of America, wasn't so sure, and so some changes were made. The first version was a prototype called the Nintendo AVS, but that one, they still had things like computer keyboards and other peripherals. Anyway, product designers Lance Barr and Don James, they were the dudes who retooled the Famicom's red and white into a sleek gray and black. They made it square to feel more like a VCR. So VCRs were these little like boxes, these really popular things in the 80s, and it allowed us to watch movies at home, kids. It was kind of like Netflix, before Netflix. They also made it front-loading instead of top-loading. The square design landed the nickname the lunchbox, by the way. So if you ever hear it referred to as the lunchbox, now you know why. They stripped it back a lot, too. Gone were all those computer peripherals, and gone were any references or appearance to previous consoles. They changed the controllers from hardwired to plug-in, added a light gun, the Zapper, and Rob the Robot, and they changed the name to the Nintendo Entertainment Center, aka the NES. Nintendo also changed marketing strategies, gearing the NES as a toy rather than a gaming console. Next, they created the Nintendo SWAT team, a 12-person team that relocated to North America with the sole purpose of campaigning to us Americans. Look, Nintendo was both ballsy and brilliant with their strategy here. They made deals with retail outlets saying they would handle all store setup and breakdown. They charged them $0 upfront, and they allowed the option to return all merch with no charges if they did it within 90 days. I'm guessing there was a lot of praying during this time, and it was a tough go and slow start, but in the end, it worked. They launched the system bundle with Super Mario Brothers. Newer systems these days, they don't even bother giving you a game, which is just a dick move in my opinion. There were 17 initial game titles when the Nintendo hit the market. In 1986, we saw the release of Metroid and The Legend of Zelda. In 1988, we had Super Mario Bros. 3. That would release and would remain one of the highest-selling games in history for many, many years. By 1990, Nintendo held over 90% of the U.S. game market. I mean, this was a massive success. Now, real quick, we appreciate the heck out of you watching the video, and it would be like really awesome if you could click that thumbs up. I mean, it helps a ton. Also, make sure you hit subscribe, down there. It's cool to have you, and we love having you, and now we're going to get back to it. So one of the things Nintendo did early on was to place a lockout feature which prevented third-party games from playing on the system. If a game was going to be released by Nintendo, it had to be authorized and it had to receive the Nintendo seal of approval. Something that helped set the NES apart was that it didn't have floppy drives and keyboards. It didn't feel like a computer and thus avoided the nerd stigma of the time. Owning a Nintendo was actually cool, even though the nerds were at home shaking their heads because it was still a computer and we knew it. The Super Nintendo would hit the US market in 1991, but production and support for the Nintendo would continue until 1995. The system was more than just a gaming success. It reinvented pop culture, and it nearly single-handedly saved the gaming industry. It also gave us icons like Donkey Kong and Mario and Link and Samus. There was a cartoon series, a magazine, we have movies, we have clothing, even a theme park dedicated to Nintendo. Now, maybe today the NES doesn't seem as impressive when stacked up against newer systems, but before you speak ill of it, remember, Nintendo was the one that paved the way for all of those systems that would come after it. It was the system that made gaming mainstream and made gaming cool. Anyway, there you have it. A truncated version behind the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment Center. Now, I'm curious how many of you started with the NES. And if you guys have a favorite NES game or like a favorite NES memory. I started with the Atari 2600, but I was really young. I barely remember it. And then we moved into the NES. and I have lots of memories. But I would love to hear some of yours. Drop them in the comments below. And remember, guys, when it comes to retro gaming and game consoles, the hunt, it's still half the fun.